They called it a mine to hide its secret. But what if one of the most dangerous weapons of the Second World War is never called a torpedo at all, and the enemy never even knew what was killing them? The Atlantic looked the same as always: gray water, endless waves, low clouds. But by the stubborn 1943, something had already changed beneath the surface. German U-boats were disappearing. No warning, no survivors, no clear explanation. Commanders wrote confused reports. Crews vanished after they had already escaped. And in Berlin, even the most experienced officers could not understand why submarines that had successfully dived were suddenly exploding in the dark.
May 12th, 1943. North Atlantic, hundreds of miles from land. A patrol bomber cuts through the clouds. The pilot has been hunting for hours. He is exhausted. The ocean below looks empty. But then radar picks up a contact. A submarine. Surfaced. Vulnerable. The aircraft descends. Engines scream. The U-boat crew spots the plane at the same moment. Men rush across the deck. Hatches slam. The submarine begins to dive. For decades, diving meant survival. That was the rule of submarine warfare. Go down, turn, change depth, wait, let the explosions pass, then escape. But on that day, the rule was already broken, because this aircraft is not carrying ordinary depth charges. Hidden inside its bomb bay is something the Germans have never imagined. Something that does not explode blindly. Something that listens. A weapon designed not to guess, not to predict, but to hunt. It is called FIDO. Officially, it does not exist, and within weeks, it will help sink dozens of U-boats without missing. To understand why this mattered, you need to understand the scale of the crisis. In 1942, the Atlantic was a graveyard. German submarines destroyed more than 1,000 Allied ships. Millions of tons of cargo vanished beneath the waves. Food, fuel, weapons, everything needed to keep Britain alive and prepare the invasion of Europe. Every convoy was a gamble. Every crossing a risk. Even Winston Churchill later admitted that the only threat that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat campaign. Because if the Atlantic routes collapsed, the war could be lost before armies even reached the continent. The numbers were brutal. Month after month, ships burned, sailors drowned. And the worst part was simple. The Allies could find submarines, but they could not kill them reliably. The reason was something called the dead zone. Destroyers used sonar. Aircraft used radar. But the moment a submarine dived, tracking became guesswork. Depth charges were dropped based on prediction, not certainty. And submarines were masters of deception. They turned, changed depth, slipped away in darkness. 9 out of 10 attacks failed. The ocean gave submarines invisibility, and that invisibility nearly decided the war. Then something changed, something radical. Instead of guessing where a submarine might be, scientists asked a different question. What if the weapon could find the target on its own? The idea sounded impossible. A torpedo that could hear underwater. A weapon small enough to be dropped from aircraft. Cheap enough to build in thousands. Smart enough to hunt in chaos. The concept had existed since the First World War, but the technology had not. until the early 1940s. The United States had just entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The situation was desperate. U-boats were winning. Convoys were collapsing. Scientists were given freedom. No bureaucracy, no delays, just results. Telephone engineers, physicists, acoustic researchers, people who had never built weapons before. Their goal was simple: build ears for a torpedo. But there was a deeper problem. Sound underwater behaves differently. It bends, travels unpredictably, echoes, disappears. The ocean is not silent. Waves, currents, animals, even ships far away create noise. The weapon had to hear through all of it. And the first time they tested the prototype, something unexpected happened. The torpedo ignored the target completely. Instead, it turned and chased a distant fishing boat. The engineers watched in shock as their secret weapon disappeared into the ocean, hunting the wrong prey. It was a failure, but also proof. It worked. From that moment, the project accelerated. In less than a year, they achieved something that today would take a decade. They created the first true smart weapon. But the real genius was not only the technology, it was the deception. They never called it a torpedo. They called it a mine. That single word kept it hidden from military bureaucracy, from intelligence leaks, from enemy spies. Even Allied crews were not told the truth. And this secrecy would become as powerful as the weapon itself. Because the Germans never understood why their submarines were dying. If you are enjoying this story, take a second to like the video and subscribe. It costs nothing, but it helps more people discover hidden stories like this. And write in the comments, would you have trusted a weapon you could not see or control? Now, here is where the story becomes even more disturbing, because the moment submarines dived to escape, they were already trapped. And in the months that followed, more than 37 U-boats would be destroyed by a weapon they never heard coming. And this was only the beginning. FIDO was already in the hands of the Allies by March 1943. Patrol aircraft began receiving the first operational units, and pilots quickly realized that their new torpedo changed the rules of the game. FIDO was silent, but deadly. It required no constant control, did not rely on random hits, and could find its target underwater by listening to the noise of a submarine's propellers. U-boats in the North Atlantic felt the pressure. German commanders noticed that diving no longer guaranteed survival. A submarine that had once been virtually invisible now became a target even when submerged. Every maneuver was tracked, and every turn could lead to destruction. FIDO tracked the sound of propellers. Submarines could not simply change direction to escape. If a captain tried to dive deeper, the torpedo automatically corrected its course, slowed or sped up, and followed the target. Instant calculations allowed FIDO to spiral toward the submarine like a hunting dog zeroing in on its scent. May 1943 became known as Black May for the Kriegsmarine. FIDO participated in sinking more than 40 U-boats in a single month. the losses were catastrophic. German submarine commanders were shocked. No dive tactics or evasive maneuvers could save them from an unknown weapon that appeared suddenly and with deadly accuracy. FIDO changed the psychology of the war. Diving became a trap. Commanders could no longer rely on proven tactics. Every submersion was accompanied by fear and uncertainty. The torpedo struck quickly, almost silently, and the fear it instilled was as powerful as the physical destruction itself. U-boats reported mysterious explosions after diving. Blasts occurred without warning. No torpedoes, no signs of attack were visible. The Germans tried to analyze what was happening, but every theory about new depth charges or radio-controlled weapons failed to explain the precision and suddenness of the strikes. FIDO operated in complete silence, like an invisible threat beneath the waves. FIDO allowed aviation to follow a drop-and-forget strategy. Aircraft could first attack with conventional depth charges to keep the submarine submerged and mask the torpedo, then release FIDO. The torpedo would enter the water, begin a circular search pattern, and guide itself toward the noise of the propellers. The result was almost always a hit. FIDO acted autonomously. It moved quietly and accurately. The Germans had no effective countermeasures. U.S. and British patrol groups began coordinating their operations using FIDO, developing new tactics for combined action. Aircraft and ships operated as a single system, with the torpedo as an invisible lever of destruction. U-boats could no longer safely traverse the open ocean. Every submerged vessel became a potential target. Submarine commanders understood that traditional maneuvers no longer protected them from air attacks. Years of naval strategy had been completely overturned. If you find this story fascinating, write in the comments, what would you have done if you were the submarine captain learning about FIDO? Share your thoughts and tell us if you would trust an invisible weapon hunting you underwater. By June 1943, FIDO continued to sink U-boats. Long-range patrols increased operational efficiency. German losses mounted, while Atlantic convoys became safer. For the first time, the Allies gained real control over the Atlantic, and monthly cargo losses dropped from hundreds of thousands of tons. FIDO did not just destroy physically, it demoralized psychologically. Submarine commanders feared diving. Every decision could become deadly. A new era of anti-submarine warfare had begun, where stealth and speed were no longer advantages. A torpedo that could hear had completely changed tactics and gave the Allies a decisive edge in the ocean. FIDO's impact on the Atlantic War was irreversible. By the summer of 1943, the Allies had gained a decisive advantage in anti-submarine warfare. U-boats could no longer operate with impunity, and the psychological effect on German submarine crews was profound. The weapon that could listen and hunt turned the ocean itself into a deadly trap. U-boat commanders reported incidents that defied understanding. Submarines would dive to escape air patrols, only to be struck minutes later by an unseen explosion. There was no warning, no wake, no trace of the approaching torpedo. It was as if the ocean had turned against them. For the first time, silence was more dangerous than the noise of battle. FIDO's effectiveness was undeniable. Aircraft could patrol the mid-Atlantic, launch the torpedo, and return to base, leaving the weapon to complete the kill. Losses among German submarines accelerated. In a matter of months, dozens of U-boats had been sunk with almost surgical precision. Each success strengthened Allied control of the convoy routes, drastically reducing shipping losses. The Germans scrambled to develop countermeasures. They experimented with noisemakers, chemical bubbles, and rubber hull coatings to evade sonar and confuse tracking systems. None of these worked against FIDO. The torpedo was not fooled by false noise. It relied on the subtle vibrations of propellers. The invisible hunter was immune to traditional defenses. U-boat crews were helpless against a weapon they could neither detect nor understand. FIDO also forced a complete shift in Allied tactics. The combination of long-range patrol aircraft, intelligence from ultra-code breaking, and FIDO-equipped bombers created a multi-layered hunting system. Aircraft no longer needed to drop countless depth charges blindly. Instead, they could force submarines to dive, then let FIDO do the work. The strategy was elegant, deadly, and efficient. Every dive became a risk, every movement potentially fatal. By late 1943, the success of FIDO was fully quantified. Depth charges dropped from aircraft had a kill rate of less than 10%, while FIDO achieved nearly 20%. In military terms, this was revolutionary. A single torpedo costing $1,800 could replace multiple failed depth charge attacks, saving resources, time, and lives. Commanders recognized that fewer weapons were needed to achieve the same effect. Production orders were adjusted, but even with fewer units, the results were staggering. FIDO's operational history included remarkable incidents. One Avenger torpedo bomber, operating off the escort carrier USS Bogue, hunted a Japanese submarine transporting critical strategic materials. FIDO tracked the vessel underwater, striking it precisely and ensuring the destruction of nearly 300 tons of cargo, including gold and rare resources. The Allies gained not just control of the seas, but intelligence and strategic advantage. The psychological impact on the German Navy was equally profound. Submarine captains could no longer rely on training, experience, or stealth. Every dive, once considered a defensive tactic, became a potential death sentence. FIDO rewrote the unwritten rules of submarine warfare. Silence was no longer safety. It was a trap. The ocean, which had provided refuge for decades, now worked against them. Even after the war, FIDO remained a technological marvel. It demonstrated the potential of autonomous, guided weapons long before modern smart torpedoes or unmanned vehicles became standard. Scientists, engineers, and military strategists marveled at how quickly the project progressed, from concept in late 1941 to operational units in early 1943. In less than 18 months, the Allies had created a weapon that changed the course of the Atlantic campaign. FIDO's secrecy amplified its effectiveness. Officially classified as a mine, its true nature remained hidden from both the enemy and many within Allied forces. The Germans never understood the reason for their catastrophic losses. Even decades later, historians marveled at how a simple concept, listening to propellers underwater, could have such a dramatic impact on the course of the war. By the end of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had shifted. Convoys were safer, shipping losses dropped sharply, and U-boat operations were severely curtailed. The weapon that no one saw, the torpedo that hunted by sound, had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. FIDO had transformed what had once been a desperate defensive struggle into a strategic advantage for the Allies. As the war moved forward, new technologies would emerge, but FIDO remained the first truly smart weapon, a silent, relentless hunter beneath the waves. It had proven that innovation, secrecy, and bold engineering could change history. And while the U-boat threat never fully disappeared, the Allies had gained control of the Atlantic, turning the tide of war in their favor. If you found this story remarkable, make sure to check our next video, where we explore another secret weapon of World War II, one so dangerous that the enemy never even knew it existed. The legacy of FIDO lives on, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one you never see coming.